Erev Tov, everyone. In 1776, our forefathers did something amazing. Based on their ideals of a democratic society, they overthrew the superpower of the world, the British Empire, and they founded a nation. And it was not all hearts and roses. To start with, there were many citizens in the United States, colonists, who did not want to break with England. So among themselves, the nation was divided. And the great men who somehow were able to birth this nation together were flawed human beings. Our first president, George Washington, he committed savage warfare. It was revolutionary at the time, pun intended, to not march in flanks and columns and regiments, but rather to conduct guerrilla warfare, and it was considered ungentlemanly at the least. Our second president, John Adams, everyone hated him. And one of the reasons they hated him is ignoring pretty much the entire populace's desire and pretty much all of his cabinet's desire. He refused to enter into a war on the side of France against England because he was worried about his fledgling nation not surviving the conflict. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, the author of the Declaration of Independence, owned slaves. Great men, but flawed. A beautiful ideal upon which to build a country, but not perfect. I know another nation that was created on the ideals of the values of Torah and the Jewish people being sovereign in their homeland. Also led by great men and women, flawed, also not achieving each ideal for which they strive. In 1899, Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, he said the following: "Of course, it's our desire to found a state of Israel, but that is not the most important thing. The most important thing is to have a horizon towards which we move. And every day, the horizon should get further from us as we move toward that goal." On my Facebook feed and in the Jewish media, the chatter this week was, after a summer like this summer, do not speak to your congregation about Israel. It's like touching the third rail, which to me signifies we definitely need to talk about it. It must be important. Before we can get to some of the tensions, and there are, this summer I heard conversation from the left saying, "I cannot believe so much human life was lost," and from the right saying, "But how can we not defend our borders?" I did hear that tension, but before we can start to address it, I think we need to take a step back. There is a growing demographic in the United States that doesn't understand why we should talk about Israel at all. They are somewhat apathetic about the Jewish homeland. So before moving on to the more tense issues, let me explain why the state of Israel is relevant to a Jew in Richardson, Texas in 2014. There are two arguments that are often made that are clear and easy, and one that's a little bit more nuanced. So I'll start with the clear and easy arguments. If I worked for one of the PR organizations for Israel, I would probably make one of two cases. The first based in our worst fears, and the second based in our utmost pride. Anti-Semitism is alive and well. The response of the world to the war in Israel this summer really clarified that for me. And not only was there political arguing of Israel's right to defend her borders, but we saw some ugly things happening in Europe and the United States. In England, produce grown in Israel and kosher food not grown or produced in Israel was thrown off of grocery store shelves. In the Ukraine and in Belgium, signs appeared in restaurants saying, "We do not serve dogs or Jews." And here in our very own United States, in northern Kentucky, there is a write-in candidate for a U.S. Senate seat, and one of his campaign posters reads, "When we choose Jews, we lose." So the argument for Israel, as made by Kenneth Stein, Dr. Kenneth Stein at Emory University, is that it is a necessary thing to ensure Jews' right to determine their fate. He thinks that as the future unfolds, the narrative about how Israel became a state will be as important to us as the story of our exodus from Egypt. Argument number one, we need Israel in a God forbid situation because anti-Semitism is alive and well, even here in the United States. Argument number two would be about our pride. Israel is an amazing nation. Think of all of the achievements they've made in science and technology. Just recently, the pill cam. You can swallow a camera in a capsule, and a doctor can see all throughout your digestive tract any problems that you might be having and make a clearer diagnosis. USB flash drives, I know I use that one almost every day. Nanowires. Zero discharge fishing, which allows people to create food with very little water or electricity. Think of the way we could feed the third world with that one. All Israeli inventions. They are ingenious people. They are also generous and caring people. At every world disaster, whether it's terrorism or due to some natural event, Israel sends out teams of highly trained individuals to help. And to me, the most amazing achievement of all is that when the gates were thrown open in 1948, thousands and thousands of immigrants have come into Israel, and they come from all over the world, and they do not speak the same languages at first, and they do not have the same values or customs, and yet somehow Israel makes it work. Somehow this Tower of Babel stands, and it is a relatively peaceful nation within its borders, among the Jewish citizens. So that's argument number two. We should be proud of Israel and all of her accomplishments. But here is the more nuanced argument. It comes from Rabbi Mishael Zion. He works for the Bronfman Institute. And he says that the 20th and 21st centuries are a tale of two Zions, one in the United States and one in Israel, and they need each other. The Israeli Zion is unabashedly particularistic. It takes place in our heritage homeland. Its conversations are conducted in our language, Hebrew, and it is very focused on the welfare of the Jewish people. The second Zion is, of course, us, the United States, and we are unabashedly universalistic. We are the Jews who supported the labor movement. We are the Jews who supported the civil rights movement. Our story takes place in the United States, which is, to some extent, the center of a lot of world conversations. Our story takes place in English, the most universal language in the world right now. But these two sides need each other, Rabbi Zion argues, because we are yin and yang. We strengthen each other through discourse, through critique of one another. Some Israelis look at the American population and shake their head and say, how can you be so assimilated? How can you be so naive? And we look at the Israelis and we shake our head and we say, how can you ignore the value of human rights? And it's through this dialogue that we challenge each other to be more complete and better Jews. So that is why, my friends, it is relevant. Israel is relevant to us in Richardson in 2014 because of anti-Semitism, because Israel gives a lot for Jewish people to be proud of, and because we need to continue our dialectic with one another. Now to the tensions. I had a teacher through a fellowship in New York. His name is Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. He started as a young man leaving his home in Chicago and moving to Hebron. He was one of the more radical religious Zionists. But eventually there was an incident that caused him to leave that part of his life. And he has written a wonderful book called "You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right." And he tells a story in the beginning of the book. He gets into a cab, and he is still modern Orthodox, so he has a full beard and he had a kippah on, and the cab driver recognized him as Jewish. And the cab was covered in crucifixes and pictures of Jesus, so he recognized the cab driver as Christian. And the cab driver says, "Are you a rabbi?" "Yes." "I have to ask you a question. What's up with Jews and Jesus? What's your take on Jesus?" As he's speeding down the highway with the rabbi trapped in the cab. And Rabbi Hirschfeld says, "Well, I believe that Jesus was an amazing individual and a wonderful teacher, but I don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God or the Messiah. But I don't think that you're wrong. I don't think that that you have to be wrong for me to be right." And the cab driver said, "I've never heard it explained that way, so can I ask you another question, Rabbi? An easier question. It's about my wife." So Rabbi Hirschfeld says, "Of course." And it turns out that the cab driver had suffered and struggled with addiction for most of his life. And his wife never left his side through all of his criminal actions and through all of the shame that he brought on their family. She loved him and she stood by him through it. Eventually, the cab driver discovered the church, and through it his salvation. He was finally able to stop using drugs. But his pastor was discouraging him from staying married because his wife was not a Christian and was not interested in becoming one. And so the cab driver said, "What do I do?" And Rabbi Hirschfeld said, "You are doubly blessed. You have been saved twice, once by the love of your wife and once through your love of your God. And I don't see why you should give either of them up. You don't have to make this about wrong and right. It can be both." People can be Zionists if they sit on the left, and people can be Zionists if they sit on the right. The issue is, can we engage in peaceful discourse? Please open your Sidurim to page 238. Now, we so like to think that everyone to the right of us is crazy, and everyone to the left of us is an anti-Semite, and only we hold the true opinion about what's right for Israel. And I include myself in this, by the way. I'm not speaking to you tonight as an official of the Israeli government or an expert on Middle Eastern politics. I'm just speaking from my heart as your rabbi. But look at the sins that we're asked to avoid in civil discourse on the top of page 238. Arrogance, condescension, stubbornness. These are not the ways to go about having a conversation about Israel, convinced that we know all the facts and that we must be right in our opinion. Rather, we must have an argument for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. This quote, an argument for the sake of heaven, comes to us from Pirkei Avot, and it tries to define it. It says, Korach did not make an argument for the sake of heaven, but Shammai and Hillel did. Now, Korach is a character from the Bible who rebelled against Moshe. And at first glance, he seemed to have a good reason to complain. He said, "Moshe, why should you be in charge of everything? Should we not be a more egalitarian society?" But as Korach is analyzed by the commentators and later on in the Talmud, he actually only had his own self-aggrandizement and causing mischief at the heart. Whereas Shammai and Hillel, first-century sages in the Mishnah, who never agreed about anything, well, 6 things. They were able to agree on 6 things in the entire Gemara. Their arguments were for the sake of heaven because they had the same objective, which was to further educate other people about what the law says and to sharpen each other's thoughts and opinions in their own stance. They wanted to strengthen each other through their arguments by making the other person think about it. Where did all the trouble start? How did we get to a place in the United States where it wasn't universally held that we should be supportive of Israel? I read a book this summer called Like Dreamers by Yossi Klein Halevi. He's a reporter. And he examined the paratroopers that were in Jerusalem during the 1967 war that liberated East Jerusalem. And many of them went on to be great leaders in the country, including a man named Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun, who was instrumental in settling the West Bank. And at the end of the book, this is when Yoel Ben Nun is probably in his 70s, late 60s, early 70s. His opinions have shifted about Israel. And he's taking a group of young people on a tour of the old city, and he's telling them about the battle that he fought. Yoel watched the dancers and celebrators with unease and sadness. Suddenly, he seemed aged. Once his place would have been among them, everything had seemed so clear then in the summer of 67, when Israel had abruptly emerged from the nightmare of annihilation into the dream of redemption. And when the settlers' opponents had raised moral and practical questions, what about the Arabs in the territories? What kind of Israel are you bequeathing us? Yoel and his friends had responded with faith. Of course it would work out in the end. What choice did we have? Reject God's gift of wholeness? Return to the terrible, vulnerable borders of May of 1967? Of course Jews had returned home with vast dreams of redemption. That is who they were, a people set apart by God as a test case for divine intimacy with humanity. But in the tumultuous love story between God and his people, failure was no less instructive than success. And so the new dreams of Zion, socialist perfection, the wholeness of the land, even the seemingly modest dream of normalizing the Jews as a nation among nations, had each successively faltered. The Messiah was still tarrying. Herzl would not be worried that the world became much more complicated in 1967. He would say, it's not a perfect nation, but we're striving toward the horizon, and it is our duty and obligation to support it. I love the United States of America, but I will admit there are some ugly things here. It took 90 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence to free the slaves. And the Reformation period after the Civil War did not do enough for its black citizens. And the civil rights movement was long overdue. And even now that we have a black president of the United States, there are citizens in Ferguson, Missouri, and cities around the United States who are afraid of white police officers. We are not a perfect nation, but the ideals upon which we are founded and the ideals upon which our leaders move us forward are beautiful and worth loving. And the same is true of Israel. Liotam chofshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim. We should be proud of Israel, and we should engage in debate about Israel here for the sake of heaven. And I'll close by offering you a few practical things you can do if you'd like to support Israel at Beth Torah. We do have an Israel Action Committee. Magdi, will you stand up? Magdi is the chair of that committee, and we're having a meeting Tuesday night at 7. Is that correct? Thank you, Magdi. There is also a mission going to Israel through the Federation in January. I urge you to sign up. It's a way of learning more about Israel and also supporting Israel financially. And finally, tonight, Gary Kahalnik, one of our congregants, will speak to us about Israel bonds, which is a way of financially supporting Israel as well. Gamar Chatima Tova.